Let's make this happen. So here we are. One more. This is the third, I think, or the fourth, third RWI touchdown of 2023. It's been a blast. So much things has been happening for all of us, and I'm really impressed with the speed of things. Right? It's like we're literally not. We didn't not only enter in another year, but we enter in another dimension of time. Right? Because it's really speeding up, and even for me, that I'm so let's say uh, used to work on various things at the same time. I've been doing this for ages. It's becoming overwhelming, like so much things. And what I'm trying to do, me, Vinicius, particularly, is trying to generate a meta, let's say, a meta view of things, where I can pinpoint some things that I can slow up a little bit, and other things that I need to speed up a little bit. So I'm starting to do some infographics uh, to for medicinal use for me. Like, it's like a type of medicine. Right? I'm just for me to pinpoint and echolocate myself, and so much things are happening. So, and I'm going to share this next on our next RWI touchdown with you folks, for folks to understand how I am pinpointing, coordinating, slowing some things here, fasting, and making some things more fast there. And it's been wonderful because I can feel again my breath, right? My respiration. And I don't know if you guys have how you guys do that, but I wonder that you guys do that somewhat, right? In your ways. But okay, that's my opening rant for today. And just it's going to be nice to hear from you, Tim, and you, Lauren. How did it come? How did it happen since our last RWI that we ended up in a wonderful way with Lauren's questions, right? Talking about Lauren's questionnaire, right? And the way that she put the questions, and to see how that sentences, that wording could provoke an aha moment, or or things like that, or oh boy, yeah. And going to be nice to hear from you folks. And yeah, so let's go on. Let's open the works. Who wants to go?
Apparently not Lauren.
Yeah.
So that leaves me.
No, I can talk if you want me to. I just I actually forgot that I was still on. I thought my voice was turned off.
Okay, no, that's I won't be very long. I'll just go quickly then. Yeah, that's interesting questions, and thanks for
like it. So I would rather him play during the game.
Where we were at. What's that?
I don't know. It's maybe her virtual
Yeah, it was
assistant.
my radio in my car. Sorry, I just got in my car.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, no, it's a good question, Vinicius. Yeah, I wish I'd like to see your illustrations or how you manage that visually. That could be helpful, maybe, to check it out, because yeah, it is tough to synthesize and keep track of all the different sort of different wave fronts moving forward on the technology side, as well as all the different collaborations and possible integrations. There was some discussions of grants coming up this week of trying to integrate different software elements and such around the Sensorica space. So that was interesting. And then there's also talk about trying to integrate some of these different democratic systems of ways to vote and things like this, ways to make decisions to get it. And that's interesting. And then something, Lauren, that you were kind of opening up to there, and I talked about, I mentioned, or you compelled me to mention Stephen's work again, because there's this outstanding aspiration that I haven't yet kind of woven into activities going on, that around how to integrate sort of the technical use of platforms and tools and such better with the much broader kind of in-person or interpersonal kind of conversations and things, and facilitated human processes, right? Because we don't always get good at integrating those. So that's another point of integration that inevitably brings together sort of different disciplines. And so, yeah, Vinicius, that theme of sorting these things out and figuring out what to focus on, and what, you know, what's the right time for the right thing for the right time is more and more challenging in that environment. So good conversation. Anyway, Lauren, sorry, I'll kind of drag that on.
Yeah. Hey
Oh
guys,
yeah. When are we gonna meet
we-
Stephen?
Yeah, we
Where's
have
Stephen?
we have Paula
Hello
here.
there.
Hey, we have
Hi,
Paula
sorry
here
about
too,
that.
guys. Paula is here.
Nice to meet you.
Paula's. Hey, Stephen. You're very welcome, man. We're doing our check-ins, so feel free to check in, you and Paula.
Yeah, you can hear me okay, so that's good. So I'm based in Toronto, originally from the UK, and I know Tim very well. I do a lot of work with communities. Actually, you can see behind me, this is one of our projects, actually, connecting across age and culture. So we call it Across Gen now. So that's one of the sort of foundational things of how to connect, how to basically do bottom-up development with communities, but looking at ways to build that up with kind of interventions and activities, but which sustains a program in some way, but also then enables that to grow into something bigger, you know, and connect up to the organizations, etc. So I've been doing that work since working in South Africa in 2004 and developing work there, and was sort of around the same time as developing some multi-arts events in London. So yeah, and very cool to be here.
Wow, thanks.
Nice to have you.
Yeah, totally, man. Paula, be very welcome.
Paula!
Yeah, it's her first RWI touchdown of 2023. So, do you want to make your check-in, Paula?
Hi, Happy New Year.
Yeah.
I'm good. I'm here to listen, check in a little bit.
Okay. So before you guys landed here, we were talking about how complexity is not only related to the theoretical spaces of talk about complexity, and how complexity is becoming a cultural trace of any society, and how we are embedding complexity in our lives, but without having the awareness that we're doing that. And how can we deal with complexity? So in my case, I was saying that I'm generating all sorts of infographics just for me to echolocate and pinpoint myself where I can slow some things here, I can fast more there, and things like that. But not only in my perspective, but in different ecosystems and different ambiences that I have been navigating through. So this is one thing that we just get started to talk about when you guys landed. So Lauren was going to say something around that. I think so. So Lauren, feel free, my friend.
Oh no, I'm driving right now, so I'll pop in later.
Okay, so and Tim just share. Tim, if you want to share it again a little bit, just what you shared with me and Laurie, just for Paula and Stephen, have the opportunity of your take on this would be nice.
Yeah, wow, it was you kind of introduced the theme of with your illustrations, your infographic idea of sort of sorting out the complexity of all the different kind of interacting and interwoven networks and projects that seem to crop up around the Sensorica or the peer-to-peer world or the open value network space, or you know, I mean, there's around the Greens for Good and other things. There's been a lot of different collaborations coming up, and at the TauDAO, Sinks, and the Holons, and that Paula, and RWI, you know, so a lot of different intersecting groups and people and projects. So sorting it out to kind of get on kind of the wavefront of where there's a windows of opportunity to implement or advance some of these ideas and implement them with technologies and platforms, and then actually integrate it into human and, you know, people processes is pretty challenging to coordinate all that. And speaking of which, there's this whole massive fire hose of learning that's been going on around Web3, right? And the promise of that, of course, is coordination. So at the same time as we're sort of seeing the challenges, we're kind of also getting introduced to maybe what might be some technologies and things that help to sort out that complexity a little bit more readily or understandably, or in a way that can support joint efforts, kind of thing. So it's a good theme that I don't know if, I guess it was on your mind, and definitely probably on a lot of people's minds. So good.
Yeah. Maybe it would be interesting just to better integrate with Stefan what we've been doing here for 2 years and a half almost. And yes, I was with that in mind, Tim, not only because I'm working on it, but it's been crucial for me even to deal on a daily basis with all things that are happening in such fast pace. So yeah, it would be nice. So you see, Stefan, Paula, I think Paula already knows this, but and maybe Tim already put you a little bit up the basics of it, what we're doing here.
I didn't actually give Stephen much of any introduction to this.
So let's go on. This thing started about 2 years and a half in the midst of when COVID, the planetary pandemic COVID hit almost all societies, or I would say all societies around the world. And previously, me, myself, and Tiberius from Sensorica, we have been doing all sorts of research and explorations to try to understand in a very peer-to-peer manner what could be reimagined, what could be understandable as the wealth and generation of wealth for the third decades of the 20th century, right? This Gregorian 20th century, right? And this is a task this is not a project. This is a constant open initiative. This is something extremely complex. This is something that you can frame it here, frame it there. You can have some, you know, some let's say some quasi understanding things, a pocket of understanding things here and there, but you're never going to have nothing universal, right? It's impossible. You can't. But you can't stack, let's say, pinpoint understandings of each thing that it's meaningful and it's important. It's fundamental for our lives, and from that you can extrapolate a lot of things. Right? You can extrapolate things that you do for you. You can extrapolate things that you do with others, and so on, so on, so on. So we have we literally, in this sense, all the conversations that we've been doing here is around that. So we don't have the pretense to change the world. We have the pretense to be in tune with the changing of things, right? That's a very different energy. That's a very different perspective. So in that sense, we are very critical of everything that has this pretentious macro narrative to change things universally. So we're talking things here in a more human size human size perspective, and trying to explore and prototype, considering all the complexity around us, right, and all the challenges that this infers, to prototype new regenerative, right, wealth generators, right? Like, what could be this new new regenerative wealth generators that we could use for our lives, and it could be part of change of projects that aims to change the very substance, the very ethos of the society as we are. So we are not here to co-create new macro system thing. We're not here to, you see, to just embark on the main macro narratives out there around singularity, for instance, technology, or around the collaborative economy, or around, you know, the transhumanism thing. So we're just critically, Web3 that is emerging. So we are not here to generate nothing that needs a lot of old resources like money, like fiat money or things like that. We're here to understand what could be this wealth, the generation of it, and the potential to be distributed within all sorts of cultures and societies. That's pretty much the take of this dynamics here, right? In that sense, we have already have people coming from all places that you can imagine, Stefan. So not only Canada, but United States, but Europe, but Africa, Australia, Brazil, right? So it's interesting that you always have a fresh take from someone that is living a different context than you, different, burdens or different difficulties and challenges. So yeah, so be very welcome, my friend.
Oh yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. So there's a kind of a real time or near time practice kind of focus. There's a near time kind of developmental, action orientated focus rather than necessarily. I mean, there's people doing the very academic theoretical modeling, but which is great. We can draw on that, but that's not necessarily the contribution here. The contribution is more in amongst the change.
Yeah, you see, you have people like Laurin that work in collective intelligence for a huge amount of space, and you can imagine that she has been with all sorts of, let's say, innovators or all sorts of thinkers that you can imagine on the planet, and she herself, she understands that, and I agree. I think me and TV and Paula, we agree with her in the sense that, yeah, it's very good to extrapolate, to make conversations and extrapolate scenarios, or even once more imagine what could be the challenges, what are the challenges, and what could be the way to, let's say, transcend our actual conditions, conditioning as societies, right? And that's okay. But one of the things that she learned, and I have been learning too, and is that most of the time, people just think that they have this one solution that can generate, the transformation of a system or a transformation of a society or of a sector or even, you know, civilization itself. So, and our take, this is very naive in some sorts, or not even naive, but maybe it speaks for the human nature, the ego of human nature, right? So, and sometimes it can be pernicious too. It can be Machiavellic. It could be, it can have some second intentions behind it, right? So
yeah, it becomes convenient in a funny way. It's like, wouldn't it be convenient if it's like, well, it's a bit like religion, isn't it? If only everyone was Christian, or if only everyone was this, or so it's a bit like that. They have their idea, and it gets overextended because it would be a lot easier if that was the reality. So they fall into that trap. But the complexity piece comes in when you're, like you say, if you're within the changes, then you're in the complexity, right? Because obviously from an external point of view, and actually we've been talking about this a lot in terms of ecological psychology, is these ideas and even words to some extent, certainly when they're written down, they're kind of dead things. So even our infographics, they themselves are like boundary objects or artifacts in our niche, and they're not strictly alive. There is a kind of a social complexity and dynamic as we interact with them. So they feel alive, but actually they're not alive, because you go back, you turn the light out, go away, come back the next week, they're still there, right? They don't walk away, they don't go and have food. But we kind of think of them as alive, but they are alive within us as we animate them. But then the question is, okay, within that animation, how are we, you know, there's that kind of living complexity, social complexity, and certain things, certainly things that are like the artifacts, we actually want to bring those back into, we often bring those back, and that's useful, into what Dave Snowden talks about as complicated, right? Something where, because when it's complicated and you're arranged like that, you can actually then go away for a week and a computer could sort of work on them with an ontology and do stuff with them, you know, but that's only because they're dead, and not in a disparative way, but literally in that sense, a useful way. But then that isn't to be confused with the living complexity, you know, like we're talking about. So, and that's often, I think, hasn't been as discussed, because most people are externalizing everything into models rather than doing what we look at as modeling, you know, real-time modeling of dynamics, as opposed to creating a model of what we think it is and putting it on a bit of paper, you know.
Yeah, but Stefan, it's incredible to hear someone that we're just being acquainted, right? So it's so incredible to hear that type of perspective coming from someone that I don't know, like you now. Like we're just getting acquainted here, because it's so rare. It's still rare. When I say it's rare, it's really rare. It's really rare. It's impressive how not so many people have the awareness around that. What you just said, right? What you just said, even to understand the differences between complicated and complex, because there are different things, you know, and to understand that if we want to better understand, be better aware around what we could consider evolution for a species, we're talking about something that is in between, right? That it's not bottom up, not top down, it's not system driven. So it's a term that we coin here called complexity doing. So we're exercising this complexity doing in all sorts of ways without taking crystallized positions of nothing, you know, just navigating through, but at the same time looking outside there and see how we can interact, how we can interface with it, how can we interface with all this phenomena that is already happening, is already changing in all sorts of aspects, even if it's maintaining the same cultural conditionings that, you know, that makes you a Canadian, you know, or makes me a Brazilian, right? And in that sense, we're talking about, we don't like, we try to avoid great great announcements or was things like, oh, we're talking about a post-capitalist thing, we're talking about a post-national state thing. Yeah. So we try to be, in our complexity, we try to simplify, because simplification is the uppermost complexity thing that happens, right? And we are complex beings. So.
Absolutely.
Hey, Vinicius?
Yes.
I just want to interject. Is this Stephen of the boundary object, Stephen? Or am I confusing you?
But I mentioned about boundary objects just now. Yeah, so that's probably me.
Okay, can you just info dump about boundary objects? Because that's what we do here. We just talk about weird shit that no one else is interested in.
Yeah, well, if you're interested, well, boundary objects is interesting in the sense that, actually, let me bring this up. This is the thing here, but I'm not going to, like, so I'll bring it. This shows up. You see on here, like, this is the person. So we've been using this actually to unpack an exercise. But say you've got a person, they interact because they're going to have to do something, right? And me and Tim are connected to something called active inference, actually, which is the idea that we're always acting to know. So that same idea could be actually could go down to a cell. A cell has to interact with what's outside, okay? And then you've got, well, what's the opportunities for action or constraint?
A little bit far away, Stephen, if you can.
Yeah, it is far away.
Maybe zoom in.
Move this in a bit.
Yeah.
This my video camera doesn't really zoom.
It's a good, interesting analog infographic.
Yeah, exactly. Let me just. Okay, so you got like. You've got your agent. Let's just say, so it's an agent base. So looking from the outside, I would do a model of what that is going on, but inside, it's modeling what's actually going on for whoever's there, me, you, practitioners, whatever, right? So there's whatever you're doing, you're interacting somehow, okay? Be it with the built world or the natural world. So this is we sort of been working to build out from the built world and natural world, but you got your interactions, and then you got what they call affordances or constraints. What's your opportunities for action or constraints on action, right? So, you know, if I'm in a room full of hammers, I've got a lot of opportunity to hit nails, right? And then obviously there's the bigger landscape that's beyond that, where you want to go with that. So a boundary object then is like, these things are basically, a boundary object's kind of like in our built world that gets brought in as an opportunity for action and interaction. Basically gives an opportunity to interact both individually but primarily with others, right? Because you've got other people also interacting. So the boundary object becomes that boundary piece that gives different types of affordances, either to primarily informationally about the built environment, you know. So normally it'd be a boundary object we talk about in these models is something that helps us understand the world, either the built world or the natural world. And the interactions is primarily how to read and dialogue with that object at that time. You know, you don't read the plans whilst wiring up the house. You know, you read the plans, discuss it, do a bit of wiring, come back, look at the wiring diagram, discuss it with someone. You know, so you move between types of regimes of attention where these objects come into and out of this sort of complex non-linear dynamic in a way, you know, because the actual thing about affordances is that the affordance is neither with the object nor with the person. It's both. So the ability to drink from a cup, the affordance of drinking, is partly held by the cup, because if it's not a cup and it's got a hole in, or it's not strong enough to lift up, it doesn't afford the ability to drink. But at the same time, if there's no one picking up the cup, it doesn't afford any drinking either. So it's somewhere between. It's a constituted idea between the object and a boundary object. Then it's probably the same sort of thing. But what makes humans particularly unique is that we have this boundary object. We pick something up and say, "What do you think of that?" And then what I think of it from then on in is probably partly built on what you think of it and what other people think of it, because it's not a flaw that we take a lot of our judgments on what we think others think. There's actually a really good video. I just saw a podcast on that. It's basically, that could be the secrets of the human species, is that ability to build knowledge out from a social awareness of reality rather than from just what I think. Because all knowing is based in groups. So
yeah, that remember me a little bit. That remember me, Stefan, a little bit. No, please maintain there. Yeah, that remember me a little bit. The studies that
I've got my video camera on a little arm now, so it doesn't move too easily. Hold on.
Okay, that remember me a little bit. The studies that Sheldrake does with morphic fields, right? And that is very interesting.
What do you think on that idea? Does that make sense in terms of boundary objects? That's how I see it anyway, a little bit, but I'm still working on this.
Can you hear Vinicius, Stephen?
Did you hear what I just said? Did you, Stefan? Are you hearing, Stefan? I think he's not hearing, Tim.
Yeah, I don't, Stephen. You can't hear us, I don't think.
Tim, Stefan, are you hearing us? Stefan, are you hearing us? Stefan? Stefan, are you hearing us? I think he's not hearing us. Stefan? No, his audio is out now. Yeah.
Sorry, my volume went on my when I went to change the angle of my camera, it switched off the volume on my microphone.
Can you hear us now?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I wondered why you guys weren't saying anything. I was trying to work.
No, Vinicius was speaking to you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What you just showed us and the explanation that you gave Stefan, it's really, 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 really interesting. And I have so much things that I think that not only me, but Tim too, and all of us here can aggregate or ask things around it. But the first thing that came on my mind was Rupert Sheldrake's work around morphogenetic fields or morphic fields, right? Something like that. That's the first thing that came to me.
How do you connect those two?
Oh, your audio is out again, Stefan.
Well, in terms of morphic fields, I don't know morphics, but the idea of morphological computing is really interesting. So basically, the idea with active inference a lot is the generative model that we start with is basically the body moving in space. So, how do I know what it means to be me gripping things? Well, a baby's doing that, and eventually they sort of narrow, they sort of become aware. So I don't know exactly that morphic fields, but I know that what they've been doing in robotics, which is interesting, is they were trying to compute how the robot would pick things up, and they were doing that like 16, 20 years. And then they started to put a field around, imagine there was a field around the arm, the hand, and around the other hand, and maybe not even just the hands, maybe the elbows, right? So it's like a field, and they were just trying to move the field closer. And they outperformed the other robots in 6 months, because it was so much more efficient, and because you didn't need all that calculations. It's like all you needed was to make sure the field got within where it got more where it needed to be. I don't know if that's quite the same thing as morphic fields, but you know, it sounds like it's tying into the morphology of the body. So there's that piece to, like, the boundary objects we use, they are also related to the affordances they offer in some ways, you know, like how big they are, how small they are, how many people can access it.
Yeah, this interactive aspect that you just shared about the boundary objects is very interesting, and relates beautifully with the concept and practices and explorations that we're doing around the concept of complexity doing. You see, Stefan? So it's really interesting, because when we're talking about peer-to-peer, we're not only talking about peer-to-peer between one human to another human, we're talking about peer-to-peer within the very, very social constructs that we came up as societies. And we're talking about the information field, the information field that inform and form us. So that's very interesting what you just shared, man.
Yeah.
And be very welcome. TB is here with us. Hey, TB. TB, do you want to check in, TB, just a little bit?
Yes. Yeah, I don't want to disrupt the flow, so you can go on. I'm just coming from a gathering with some very interesting people from Common Stack, Holochain, and Grassroots Economics, and Michel Bauwens. It was very, very interesting conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, you see, the folks over Common Stack, I don't know if Stefan knows about them, but they are a type of disciples of Armstrong. So having someone as the Bauwens is like having you know, some religious figure around Armstrong. So for them, it's like someone that is no, we have to hear what Michel Bauwens has to say, because he's so well respected. And I'm saying this with the kind of my heart, because Michel Bauwens is a friend too. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you have that impression, TB, but it's maybe something like that. But we're talking about, so Stefan, would you like to just sum up a little bit?
Well, there was an interesting,
TB?
actually, it ties into this idea of fields and just a way of knowing. And I actually had an interesting conversation last night with someone about this, because they were interested, you know, how people think about electromagnetic fields. Well, one thing that comes up in ecological psychology is that the idea is that when we're interacting with the environment, there's a kind of a resonance of sorts, even though that's more of a metaphor. So what you find is that, like, if we're talking these ideas of a boundary object or something that might be in our environment that helps us navigate meaning about the environment, and then maybe that meaning is used in the environment with actions and interactions with tools, you know, and then we come back and look at the plan or the boundary object, and then we carry on and do a bit more. But one thing that was interesting is that there was often been this idea of field, the idea of some sort of sense of a field out there is quite present, right? It's used in theory, it's used in a lot of other things, but it becomes like the idea of, okay, you've got electromagnetic fields in physics, and then they got this, okay, so now let's imagine there's something like that, and then we go into and then you need a kind of a transcendental explanation to sort of cover that. But when you start working with things like ecological psychology in that, well, if the act of interacting and doing at the same time where you're interacting and doing, mediated by boundary objects or something like that, a meta boundary object, i.e. words, you could say words effectively a meta boundary object, right, that we're throwing out there. We're kind of resonating with each other. And, you know, we're resonating with the meaning. We're resonating also with my meaning of what it is to be in this room. And that's kind of like a field. My interaction, but it's not, doesn't actually require for that particular thing an actual electromagnetic field. It doesn't require that, you know, it's not to say that there isn't that going on. I mean, I'm certainly getting electromagnetic radiation in my vision and stuff, but it gives something like it through this resonance between my physical states, mental states, brain states, and yours.
Yeah, it's
know?
like it's like gravity, the weak force, right? The weak force on the physics. It's all over you. It's the ether, right? It's the ether is the medium that exerts an ambience around it, but it don't have the strong force. The strong force is the result of the interaction with these boundary objects that you conceptualize, Steph, in that sense. I'm just brainstorming here.
No, exactly. And if you replace that with informational kind of resonance, but there's a kind of a weird. This is where the jury's out, right? It's very fertile in the last little while. Quite how that resonance happens but the resonance could be inferred by patterns. So basically, I'm guessing and you're guessing, but it's close enough that we can keep talking and have a conversation, right?
Yes.
As long as we're in certain bounds, because I will never know exactly. I don't even know exactly what I'm. Once you get beyond a certain point, what I'm thinking myself, right? So there's dynamics going on beyond my conscious, but there's also. But we're able to hold it together. And a boundary object makes that easier, potentially, because we're able to hold together more resonating.
Yeah, we could extrapolate and say that we have boundary selves, right? Like you create a persona. A persona is a type of a boundary self, like that you use as a vehicle, as a container to interact with other boundary selves, other personas, and boundary objects. I don't know if you.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
Yeah, because you see, the thing about being honest with you, being transparent with others, is something that, in terms of evolution, I think that our ancestors were more truth for them with themselves, because their animal instincts were not, let's say, captured. You see, we're not captured by the mentalizations of our existence, the preconceptualizations of our existence, and now we're totally captured by the preconceptualizations of our existence. So that's what I'm saying.
Well, absolutely. I mean, in theory, like if I was here, and I should, in theory, if you wanted to see me, you'd see me. This would be me. But we don't, do we? We focus on this. There's something particularly about humans in terms of our faces, where it's very much. There's a reason we've got so many facial expressions, right? It is kind of like, and it's a shortcut and it's useful. However, it's not me. If that makes sense. But it's a useful. Like we always like you don't have you don't show my chest, for instance, during the whole Zoom call, right? You just focus on the face, right? And that is sort of I don't know what you call it, but you call it like a mask there's something about that way of symbolically communicating at an identity level. But then like you say, naturally, you don't have this cropped in, framed view of each other, and you wouldn't have the mediation of many boundary objects as well. I mean, a boundary object then would be maybe a stone or a cave or something,
Yeah, some time ago, we had a conversation here about how we cannot bullshit ourselves, right? Because we constantly bullshit ourselves. In that sense, all things that we organize is already bullshitted, right? Because it already comes with this ingrained bullshitting thing that we do with ourselves, right? So, and we're talking about how sex can deconstruct, can, let's say, do something what in the 80s called create a type of autonomous zone, autonomous boundary zone, or that you free yourself to be yourself in the nude. So when we are nude and doing sex with each other, so we talk about swing clubs, for instance, where people coming, couples or singles, whatever, they just free themselves from their personas or their self-boundary personas, and they are really being what they are really want to be, right? And that very moment. So, and we didn't make the transition. This is a very intimate thing. We didn't make the transition. We really didn't have the time to make the transition between this very intimate self of us to be exposed in societal dimensions, the dimensions of what we call society, see? Because we got totally captured by the boundary objects as you speak, and the self-boundary personas that we created to speak for ourselves, right? To negotiate and to create. And I will say this: there's the legal world. You put the material, the artificial world, and this artificial world, you can have other domains, right? You can have this legal structure as what we call society. This is a social construction too. So this is a critical object, I would say, even a very critical and a huge critical object that regulates the boundaries between these boundary objects and ourself. You see, self-boundary personas. Yeah, this reminds me of the simulacra and simulation that was studied in the 70s, right? And how we create a lot of simulacras and simulations around at all times. So I'm talking a lot. I'm just
no, but it makes sense because another thing that's interesting is things are relative, right? Because I'm actually thinking, I hadn't really thought about this so much before, but like I talked about the natural world and the constructed world. So say you're going into a situation where, okay, people can relax, they can release their persona. So you see it probably goes two ways. There's either a particular type of space, so you enter that space, there's normally a threshold, and there's an implicit tacit agreement about how the values and the openness is going to be in that space, right? Or maybe it goes to a space which is very natural worldy, but in a way there's a tacit sense of like, and then boundary objects mean something different in there. I mean, you might, and it may actually become more like, so the other thing I like is I talk about, in a way, when you interact with things and objects around coordination, you have boundary objects. When you have performative experiences, you have boundary experiences. So one of the challenges you have, say if you're doing an experiential activity or something, it's invisible. You can't show someone a boundary object. So you need a boundary. So you say, it was like that, but that had to be experienced at some point. So you kind of got, it was like seeing that play, and you can't give them the diagram of the play. It doesn't work. They have to have seen something at least similar.
It's experiential by nature. Existential.
Yeah, exactly. And so
it's not content driven. Oh, that's another thing that I forgot to say. You see, all the boundary objects are content driven in the sense that they have their substance, at least in my take as we're speaking, are content related. They have some content that define the boundaries of the object itself. So the same thing we do with us in terms of ideology. So when we create the self-boundary persona, they are ideologistic related. They are content. They're not experiential.
No,
they're not truly experiential.
They're an object. Well, it's like that diagram on here, right? It's like the useful thing about it is when it's there, I can keep coming back to it, but it isn't it. It's not trying to be it, but it's a useful thing. But the boundary experience is the other way around. It's got the richness, even if it's only going to be a trace of that you can remember, So it's like there's something about that, and that could also be negotiated. I mean, that's where there's this question, isn't it? Like, and I think that's where the process comes in. I had this a little bit when I was in South Africa. There's a theory that in theory we could just sort, some people's minds, they'd be like, well, if we just put a sign up saying, do this, don't do this, like reinforcement learning, then, and it's like, but with anything that's more intimate knowing, that's the exact opposite. You basically say, no, you can't, you need to have a series of interactions where there's some way of making that knowing happen. And at some point it'd be like, and you basically get the chance to keep going and then say, oh, no, this, this isn't right in this context here. This isn't doing so. It only proceeds as the experiential things show that the dynamic and this place, this time, this space is going to afford that level of intimacy, right? And
Yeah,
you can't signpost that, you know. I mean, you can have tools that kind of supposedly help, but they have a risk of doing more damage. You know, this is where process comes in, right? This is where that ability to process and the ability to be in the moment is important. I mean,
you said it all. You said it all. The
yeah,
ability
yeah.
to be in the moment, man. You see, this reconceptualize and resignifies what we call agency, right? Because the way that we talk in the peer-to-peer world about agency, man, it's so superficial. You see, it's so organizational, it's so institutional, it's so economical. It doesn't consider it doesn't consider the complexity of our natures, of our own natures, and what could be agency and something like that. You see, Stefan, what could be? I don't know. I don't have a clue. Maybe what should just describe.
That's a good question. Yeah, I think Tiberius has got a question as well. Or an insight.
Yeah, I came late, but maybe it's also good for someone that would watch the video later. Maybe can you provide a short definition of boundaries, and then how would you apply it to an organization? Because we talk about individuals here. If you take an aggregate of individuals and there is an emergent property of that, how would you apply this concept when it comes to organizations interacting with each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think boundary objects are maybe almost used more in that. I mean, it sort of comes out of systems world because it's like a way of negotiating. And then in the human day-to-day, it can be like an artifact. But you're right. So it's the question then becomes is looking at the organization as depending on how you look at the like one way of looking at the organization is that's coming out of active inference now, and some of that morphogenesis type approach, where we grow into being our identity at all levels. Our cells, basically, my liver cells is trying to grow into being a better liver cell in relation to the other liver cells, and my liver is trying to be a better liver in relation to, and then at this scale I am trying to be, and then at some level, at the organizational level, we're collectively trying to see stuff on our collective, they call it a Markov blanket, but the sort of the collective reference frame. What would I see on my blanket if my organization was to be more like the organization I believe it to be, right? Be it an oil company or a medical sales company or whatever, right? So then you've got that question about what is it that I'm seeing in the world? So that's me being, and then how am I going to, well, within an organization, the organization can't move as it's, well, only in very abstracted kind of legal institutional context can an organization move as an organization. You know, it can move in a contract, I suppose, and it can move, but in a living way, it's a bit like it's a bit like even more, it's a bit like the cells in my body but being separated in space, you know, where they're sort of communicating but they're not all in the same wetware, right? Because we're all separated in some way. So how is it that there's a sense of what this boundary object does in terms of, like, that's probably why we tend to see boundary objects which are like system diagrams. It's not a surprising thing that's often used in organization, a system diagram or a plan, something that's related to some other dimensionality. It's framed in terms of timelines, or it's framed in terms of like tasks being done. If this organization was being the sort of organization that I would expect it to be, I would see these types of things happening. in relation to this kind of metric, in relation to what I see as being maybe a product. So I don't know, boundary objects in a kind of a practical organizational sense, I think you can be seen as this kind of, because the organization can't interact with anything, but the people in the organization can. So in a way, it's a bit like, so, but obviously, unlike a human, in theory, I can be the agent, right? But the organization, it's like the agent is a series of people doing things within a certain scale. And then I suppose mostly, you know, yeah.
Stephen,
Yeah.
can we imagine a network situation to make it less abstract? Because I really want to follow you and I'm getting lost in the abstraction.
Right. Well, so in a so it depends what type of organization.
How about this? Can I just name a scenario?
Yeah,
that's
go on.
a complexity thing.
Yeah.
So let's just say we're at an event,
Yeah.
and there are a bunch of people. How do we use like boundary objects in this thing? Like there might be, say there are like a few hundred people at the event. How do you get the right people? What boundary objects do you put to get the right people into the right rooms together and meeting each other, so that it's like an effective conference? So if we could just like have like a metaphor, to me that's almost like a boundary object, because now if we think of the same metaphor, it's like now we have a context in which to put our things, and now we can work from the same metaphor. We don't have to have like the same experience at the conference, the same philosophy. But now that we have a metaphor of the conference, now we have a context in which to imagine, so we can at least be having an
that's a good one. Well, you could imagine like, okay, you've got a conference and all the people, say we're actually in the planning stage of the conference and we're all going to come together and the organizers are there and I'm coming and I'm going to do, you know, you might have Red Bull has got a stand, and you've got Save the Children's got a stand, and you've got Reed Educational Publishers has got a stand, right? You've got 3 different stands, right? So each of them are going to have an identity idea of what they are. What sort of things would Red Bull be putting on their stand? What would Reed Publishers be putting on their stand? What would World Wildlife have on their stand, right? So there's certain things of what it means, and then what does it mean to be someone putting on an event? So there's that, all those people are doing that, and they're going to have a plan, and they're going to be negotiating through some sort of bound, like it's not just going to be a story, right? There's going to be some sort of structured boundary object which gives a sense of the constraints and affordances, i.e. the opportunities for action and the limitations on action. I.e. you can't just put your stand anywhere, right? You're A5, you're in section B7, right? So that becomes that. But then once you get into what does it mean to do an event, generally speaking, that's why you get people who've done events before, right? Well, you could theoretically just get people who do like construction engineering to do the event thing, because they could still work out what goes in what box, right? The thing is, what the other people are doing is they're working out what the boundary experience is going to be, or what the kind of relational, I mean, at some point, and then beyond that, what if they're going deeper into a performance, you know, what's the experience of the person? So you see, so then it's not so much about boundary objects, it's a bit more about aesthetics. Yeah, that's true. Okay.
I just wanted to pipe in, because in all the many hours of conversation I've had with Stephen, I've never discussed boundary objects with Stephen before. So it's
we're riffing a little bit.
We're kind of zooming in on something that's very specific that maybe I don't even know how it fits in. And Tiberius's question, maybe boundaries objects aren't the main tool or element or relevant thing there, so I didn't want you to feel you had to focus in on specifically the boundary objects. But Tiberius, your question, maybe you want to clarify a little bit, like because you have a practical I think, interesting.
Yeah, it's well, I'm going to tie it with Lauren's question, and maybe move a step forward. You know, when we think about organizations, I heard your description, Stefan, saying that you know, there is no organization, there is people. I don't know if we can apply the idea of a field here, but what I'm trying to say is that if we go to Lauren's event and she says, guys, this is a Halloween event. So all of a sudden people know that they have to dress up and they have to be goofing around the whole night. So that is the emergent property, meaning that you're not going to be yourself. You're going to be this, I don't know, Bugs Bunny goofing around all night, right? And that's what people expect from you, and that's what you produce. So the organization is some sort of you know, uniformity or something that people share that will drive their behavior. Okay, so in a sense, the organization is something. It's not just a bunch of individuals. And the organization can act as one, because if you look from outside, you see something very interesting there. You know, you see a Halloween party and you know what it is, and that Halloween party can have a sort of an array of possibilities, right? It can degenerate into a cowboy fight, but you know that people are not going to start crying at all of a sudden in mass. You see.
There'll be
Because
some
it's
sort
not
of
a funeral.
Yeah,
know?
there's a field, so well, so going into, we'll say you say something very free flowing like a Halloween party, which we have a kind of preconceived cultural experience to anchor, and then you're going to have a flyer. You might have got some sort of graphic, something comes through. So before everyone goes there, they look at it, and you sort of see, like, if it's got a lot of very dressed up, flirty kind of like costumey type graphics, you might all go more down that route. If it's a very kind of, it's just got a little champagne glass or something, maybe it's going to be kind of a chilled kind of, you know, so you kind of calibrate a little bit beforehand, and then you get there and then you kind of adapt to what's in the space. So yeah, so in those cases, there's apart from maybe a flyer, there's not necessarily a defined plan, if that makes sense. So I think that's a good. So that's where it gets interesting, when how much are you, and you can. I mean, this is we're sort of talking a little bit in kind of on the boundaries of knowledge here, but like the idea of how an like you can act as an organization in effect, but even like me and my body, I look like I can act as me, but I just moved my hand. I actually just moved how many million cells. Right, it feels like it's a hand, but actually it's all a whole load of stuff working together in an effective way. Like an organization, it's like in a soccer match, right? Everyone doesn't run after the ball, but the team is still playing football, but it's still only one player at a time. If that makes sense. So the same with the organization. Like, it may be that we've got this team and they make the product and it goes down, it gets checked, goes through a quality control, gets packaged up, and then dispatch sends it out. And at that point in time, dispatch is the interface between the organization and the customer. But the actual organization has kind of all moved together because they're all coordinated. But at the same time, a lot of that organization is never seen by the customer.
You know what? I know something. I just downloaded something. Okay. You remember before we were talking about the difference? I think it was Vinicius who mentioned complexity versus complicated. And to me, in a complicated scenario, what works are categories. So in any kind of complicated thing, like an organization, top down, you have someone who's like, what are the categories that we need? We're going to put everything in the categories so that people can find things in the right categories. Mm-hmm. Except that doesn't work well with complexity, because in complexity, you're having emergence. So you have things that don't fit into new categories. And so, they either like cross category things or in both categories, or sometimes there's like completely new stuff. And so they're hard to just put into categories. And then you have interoperability where everyone has their own category system of the way they view the categories and put their metaphors and we in this organization or in this thing, we put this in this box and that in that box, and this is the words we use to describe this one picture in the mind. And so I think that boundary objects, to me, allow for emergence when there are no beyond the categories, or when you're dealing with two entities who may view one single thing in very different ways. They can then use this boundary object to position themselves. So if I think about this in embodied cognition, when I'm dancing with someone, you could be like, okay, I'm just like thinking of like salsa dance. When like usually you're dancing together, which is that's such complexity that it's hard to kind of figure things out. Like someone like a man, sometimes he just goes like this with his hands and he keeps them really firm and still, and then I can use his hands to actually have something to push off of, so I can do my little dance on my own. And that gives me agency to move how I want without having an interaction with another person. It can just like, I can do my little things that I want to do because of that like firmness. That boundary allows me to take advantage of my agency and express myself in the way that I want to express myself.
Interesting. So that's where I think it's quite useful seeing how to deflate, to bringing these things down to, because you've got that idea, like you've got literally this idea of a boundary, but say you deflate down, you say there's something in my space, and that space is like everything that's active and that's alive is complex.
Vinicius, can you mute yeah.
So everything, let's just see, one of the things I sort of been, say everything that's interacting is at level is complex adaptive, right? So the dynamics are complex adaptive, and at some point we're able to kind of put things almost as a dead thing. So rather than necessarily follow, because boundary objects wasn't necessarily like, there is the way it gets used is a little bit less embodied than what we're talking about. But so I'm talking about like just using that general idea and keeping with it for that. So you've got, when you put your hands out, it's still part of a dynamic. You could say it's still part of the dance, still part of, so say it's all complex, it's all alive, but it serves almost like a signal, a dead signal. It just happens to be your hand at this moment, right? Mm-hmm. But you could get a piece of metal with two hands on it, right? And the person could practice just with that. It didn't, and that one piece you could do without someone else being alive, just to practice the moves. But it would never be a dance until, so there's a little bit there where you kind of emulated something being, so if you say all complicated stuff is basically externalized, so it's not like I'm necessarily per se, I mean, let's just say that, let's just say everything, let's keep everything in the complex within reason, right? Everything's complex, and any embodied cognition is effectively complex, because if it's a complex adaptive system or non-linear complex adaptive system, then that's what we're living in, right? But like you say, that once you put it into the categories and you've got, okay, here's the hands that you can dance with, or there's all different things. Now that, all those things, they can be put into an ontology, and that can be put into a dead system like a computer. And now it has its own thing. So like you say, in an organization, you tend to have rules people and you tend to have process people. But they're still doing complex stuff. They're still basically being complex humans. It's just that one is trying to prioritize stuff on dead bits of paper out there either ones that we're imagining or ones that are out there, i.e. the rules, and they tend, or the ontology or the classifications, and the other ones are maybe following more. I mean, they're both following a bit of both, right? Because you can't not, because you're alive, right? But, or you're following more like the process and the feel for the dynamic in the moment. And we're obviously a blend of both. But it's the rules people tend to, it says it on the sign type of, and this is what it says. It says you have to do A, B, C, D, okay? And it gets us through life in some context fairly okay. But that, let's just say that is that itself is a complicated system when it's been self-organized, or not self-organized, but when it's been put in a computer or something like that, or when it's been put in a system which can run on its own as dead and helps us. But when it's in our environment, everything is complex at some level. Like it's complex moving into chaos on one side and dispersion into nature and organically living with that, or it's trying to be constructed. So I sort of see if you talk about the environment, you've got the constructed environment, the things we make. So in my room here, most of everything around me is dead, whether I like it or not. Most of it, I want it to be dead. I don't really want mold growing up the wall, right? But if I dissolve these walls down and I would have trees all around, I'm in nature. It's a completely different dynamic. It's just that I'm not used to sitting in nature that much as I would have been in the past, right? So in some ways, it's like, what is, the more we're in a construction, the more rules make sense to have, because we're more and more of what's around us are dead things that could be organized on their own, like in an IKEA catalog, artificial intelligence design scene. But there's something about us talking in real time now, which is sort of mediated clearly. So we have that overhead because we have to we're using a camera and we're trying to get as much information, but there's that it will always be complex, but there's complicated bits in between me and you guys and you and each other, i.e. the video equipment and everything. Yeah. Oh yeah, Tim talks about phenomenological perspective. Yeah, so yeah, how there's kind of, this is the question that sort of working on, is how to get a tractable way. And I think the tractable way is to simplify down.
Just thought it might be good just to pause and point to that, just so that because it's a helpful orientation to, I find it's something that requires translation, because even though Vinicius reminds us of it a lot, how we get stuck in systems and representations and things, right? Sometimes we still don't even realize just how deeply embedded that is. And so it's really kind of a shift in perspective that most folks aren't necessarily familiar with or frequent to make that shift in perspective to that phenomenological way of knowing, so to speak. And it's sort of embedded in everything you're saying, but you didn't actually kind of point to it or talk about it yet. So maybe it's helpful to kind of help explain that interior aspects.
Yeah, but before you attempt to do that, Stefan, just what Lauren shared and your response to what she shared, for me, it came out differently. For me, one of the things you said, it's really relevant for us to better grasp the concept of boundary objects, is the signaling. The signal it's very important. Without signals, whatever signal, image, sound, whatever, we don't have the basic elements to establish that a boundary object exists, right? If it's so whatever. So the signaling is crucial in my understanding. And signaling for me is about information, right? Because information is energy. Information is everything. Information surrounds us. So The signaling is when you have sufficient, let's say, aspects of the so-called boundary object to become a boundary object. So he only becomes a boundary object when some observer interacts the observed. You see, when you have this relationship between the observer and the observed. So this interrelationship, this interplay between the observer and the observer with the signaling, that's the informational field that makes possible the existence of the boundary objects. So this is one of my first take of what you just shared. And another thing is when Lauren talk about the salsa dance and the hands, for me, is not that itself is not generating a boundary object. It's more like generating affordances to interplay with different boundary objects. You see, where you are the agent behind it. You have the agency to say what kind of affordances you can have with different types of boundary objects. That's my two takes. That's what you just shared, considering what Lauren shared with us or provoked for us.
Yeah, this is a really good, this actually is really relevant because sort of ties a bit into what we mean by phenomenological as well, because what has been maybe the big thing, and active inference does this, and it really takes a big thing to get the head around, is basically in predictive processing, it's saying, what does it mean to get information, right, at its real foundational level? So one way is that it comes to me, right? But in a way, it's like, actually, my eye is only sampling like that when actually look where the eye is. But I see this. But how does that work? And how am I to talk in real time if I'm supposed to be bringing stuff in and computing and talking? Yeah, I look like I'm already saying stuff ahead of when I would know how to say it. So what it's basically saying is, what if everything, this is what active inference says, is, and it came about because Carl Friston actually invented the scanners for the brain scanners, those big NMR scanners. He was looking at the brain, and he'd been looking at this for a while and predicting how it works and what, how the flows are in there. So he suddenly thought, well, I'm trying to work out and I can never find, I'm always trying to access it, but I never can, right? I'm always outside. He says, what happens if the brain's doing the same? And actually then it extrapolated out the body and everything living's doing the same. So i.e., I'm not seeing you, I'm predicting what would happen when my eye does this sort of thing, and if I got that sort of pattern. And that does something very interesting, because now you sort of are building up a bit like, an artist who goes in, paints a stroke on a painting and goes out, and goes in, strokes a paint on a painting, goes out, and eventually they paint a picture. Well, what if we're doing that in real time with our vision? It's just so smooth and effortless that we see it all joined up, right? So effectively, I'm selecting and I'm supporting evidence. So what you basically find is information is about prediction errors. It's where things aren't what you expect. Otherwise, you kind of see what you think you will see. So if you look into your room, you basically see things that you can do stuff with, things which can make things happen. You don't even see the ceiling and the floor, but it's in your field of vision. It's like here, like I have to crop my camera down. I don't have to do that with my eyes because I don't really notice the ceiling. I'm seeing it because it doesn't. There's nothing surprising about the ceiling. Now, if the ceiling suddenly had a big hole in it, you'd be the lumps falling out. I'd be sure as hell looking at the ceiling, right? So there's something about that. There's something about that foundationally changes how, because that came in, phenomenology is coming in now, because because basically if the brain's a computer, you don't need phenomenology much. But if I have to predict by acting and interacting in the world, and the brain has no way to do that, because the brain has no way to interact on its own, it needs the body. So suddenly phenomenology is coming in center stage all of a sudden, and embodied cognition is beyond just the idea that I'm an embodied agent receiving signals. I'm actually, the body is the knowing at a foundational level, but then that's at the level of the eye muscles and how the eye muscles move, and each cell moves at certain ways. So so this becomes really really interesting because, and if then the idea of a boundary object shifts from being boundary object. So normally you've got boundary objects. Okay, here's the boundary object. Signal, 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 compute, 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 act, act. Well, if it's not that, it's affordance in the niche for action, my prediction of what I could do with it. So there's some truth in the fact, because I'll soon find out, will this fit on my head or not? Yes, it does. Okay. So it's true, it did have that affordance. Okay. But it's neither, it's partly in my ability to put it on my head that it has the affordance to be a hat. It's partly in the shape of my head, and it's partly in this thing. So the phenomenology of me interacting is the knowing, as opposed to, oh, look, hat that goes on head. I've just had my signal. Does that make sense? And actually things start to fall into place really nicely when it's more about this dynamic prediction. So in a way, maybe that's the boundary object idea that came out of the signal process response world, which is basically how cognitive science has been for the last 60 years. Whereas if you bring it into, oh, it's enmeshed in the niche, and I will be interacting and affording, and I will be generating what I think my predictions are of what it means. You know, it's like if you get the wrong end of the stick and it's that classic thing, you know, like someone turns up at the party in the fancy dress costume, right? Because they were predicting, all their predictions had started to infer that it was a fancy day and no one else there and it's a funeral, right? Or something like that. And they're like, oh, I saw Uncle John's, oh, I misread it, you know, blah, blah, blah. Up to that point, they predicted that this all meant something different, right?
Can I put another metaphor out there and see what you think? I'm thinking of bats and their sonar and how they send out sonar and being like, oh, I predict that is like 20 feet away, and that if I fly in, like I don't want to fly into that, so it allows like a bunch of black bats to fly around and not hit each other or hit the objects. Or okay, oh, here's another one for any engineers who may be here. So I was talking to Vincent about network, and he says that the important thing about the boundary object is not just that it's like the complicated way of doing things in a network is like what category are you in? But boundary objects put almost another dimension to the categories of like, there's a category. It's not like whether you're in it or not in the category, it's the relationship to the category. So you might have a relationship to something. You might be like, oh, that disgusts me. Like I am repelled by that. And someone else may be like, I love that. Someone else may be like, I just have no opinion on that whatsoever. And so it's not like whether you're just like, are you in the category, but like, how do you relate to this boundary object? So that I think that differentiates it from just categories that you're in or you're out, the box that you put in. It's just like, you know, it's the quality of your relationship to something.
Yeah, I mean, that might be, I know Tim's got his hand up. There might be something even Tim has a thought on. Just one thing with that, because this is, I hadn't thought about this, but this is the thing, and I think some of you have got maybe more experience in the kind of networking of and sort of computational world, is when something is in a categorized network system, then it will be signal processing, because that's how that works, right? So there's what we're talking about as an object in a niche that we're sort of co-creating meaning around and negotiating action and how attention happens and cues for action as agents. And then there's, if that same thing in a network as computed by one of those algorithms, well, in there, it won't be a predictive processing thing. Like each of those nodes is not doing an embodied predictive processing on surprisal and trying to get a fuzzy logic out, fuzzy sort of modeling that is different every time. No, it is what it is, right? It will give you the same answer, and they will have a relationship, and they will have an ontology, and they will have a taxonomy. So that, I haven't really thought about that. I don't know, Tim, I'll pass it over to you anyway, but there's something interesting there.
Yeah, I just was writing, I had my hand up just to talk about, to point to that Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead has this idea he talks about in some of his writings, calls it prehension. And what he's speaking to there, and it's like, the word prehensile thumb, prehension, the idea of, or apprehension. It has this, I guess, roots in its semantics or its meanings of the word of like grasping and reaching out and grasping. So I think that's a good connection there. Like Whitehead is talking about how the organism, and Whitehead's philosophy has been called a philosophy of organism. And so what he's describing when he talks about prehension is he's trying to get at a very abstract, I think, human concept of something like what you're talking about, which is how does my assemblage of mind and body and sensation and ability to act and reach out, how am I reaching out for understanding into the world, either into the inanimate or the constructed world or the natural world or the world in this sort of interaction dynamic with other beings or other living things and other agents in the environment, what have you, right? So how am I reaching out, and what do I quote unquote feel? Whitehead also really developed a whole conceptual richness around the idea of feeling. In fact, he talks about the kind of teleological type or teleonomic kind of aspect of an organism as ultimately, and I think Deleuze takes this further, but desiring feeling, I think, is the word, or so. What is the feeling, and where is it drawing you? Where is it pulling you? And this is how the organism explores its world in a way. And so you're kind of talking about that interface, right, where the hand, where the hand is in the glove, so to speak, where we're in touch with whatever it is we're experiencing, and that's not like a big spotlight. That's not like a big cinema screen. That's not just all of it all there. It's a very, very, very unique and kind of intricate contact with the world or with other people, right? In its very unique way, in terms of how it's experienced and lived. And in as much as you can sort of reveal that or appreciate that a little more, it opens up a little bit more room, I think, more possibilities. So there's a richness in it there. Whereas the big cinema screen representational, ontological, categorical, taxonomic, systematic kind of description of things, like you used the word a lot in the beginning when you came on the call, is dead, right?
Yeah, that's a good description, actually. And maybe that's that. There is a boundary there, isn't there, between dead and living, which has been, as well as between different living people.
Yeah, in an abstract space. Yeah, in a kind of an abstract notion of what we're talking around here. Yeah, there's sort of an interesting distinction of that's probably not clear either. It's fuzzy, to the degree to which something is responsive or not, and the degree to which it's alive for us. We use those expressions, right? What is alive for you, right? So it's kind of a whole spectrum of engagement.
Can I ask something of Stephen? Stephen, what led you to this work? What was the actual thing in your personal life that you were dealing with and trying to figure out that led you to some path towards these boundary objects?
Well, we were doing a mapping process in South Africa with the community to help the children prepare for an interactive performance, interactive participatory theatre play, and they were too shy to get involved. So we developed, they did an activity with a mapping of their community and then they would have to try and place themselves in resonant hotspots. And basically they, on the map, they would create clusters and make little mini stories on there. And because it was 25 kids, it was like a large group process. So they kind of got lost in the landscape, and which we sort of, I called it sort of like a social topography. So what's the social topography that they're looking at? And the question was, okay, so they're going on this map, and we tried to put a recording framework into it with Health Canada. And it was really hard, because as soon as you started asking questions, you killed the kind of exploration on the map, right? Because the whole point was they were in this sort of flow, right? And then we made it more and more, let's go the other way and just make it more exploratory. But the question is, well, what's going on in there? And how can we get to know? And the other reason made it harder was because it was all happening in Zulu language, isiZulu. So I couldn't ask them in their native language, right? So that question sort of led into social topographies. And then I started looking up social topography, because we created this process called sociodrama topography, the social landscape. And looking it up, I then found social panoramas by just looking, and then socio mapping and all these other methods, particularly, and then mental space psychology sort of came out of that. And then I would say I heard about boundary objects and made the connection, because I'm connected with Tim to Systems Thinking Ontario. So boundary objects are sort of used there, and I hadn't really heard of it apart from through systems thinking. So I'm sort of taking that concept, which has its own history and its own rationale, and I sort of bringing that over here a little bit, because the idea is when they're on the map, they were using pieces of fabric to sort of negotiate the map. Originally we did it in chalk on the floor, but over time we started using fabrics. They had fabrics, and then we did the same activity with adults in townships around environmental health and then water issues at another place. So this question about, well, what's going on there? Because the idea is that they explore, and they someone say, just make it an artsy map. So they know what it means, but it's not very representational. And there is a whole thing called non-representational geography apparently now. Well, there is. So I didn't know about it then. So this idea of a non-representational approach to the geographies, as opposed to more of a mapping classification approach. And the idea is let them go in, let them explore, let that exploration discovery happen, let that sense of a social topography or an affective landscape at that level happen, so that they feel empowered to have strategic conversations. Because it was like night and day, the children who did that workshop doing the play, and those that hadn't just wouldn't even go up and intervene at all. But suddenly they had belief that they knew something to talk about, right, on the subject. So that's kind of the journey. Yeah, and I'm actually trying to do a PhD on that.
It's kind of almost like a radically more enriched or deeper concept of that truism or quip that people say. I hear a few times. It's helpful, and I think communicates a lot. Is start, quote unquote, start where people are, start where you're at. So what Stephen's doing is he's trying to address a really complex social, cultural challenge, basically something that we can't talk about. And since we can't talk about it, what words will we point to, or what diagrams will we point to discuss it? Well, we won't, because there aren't any. So let's go into an environment, let's create a landscape where we can embed ourselves and explore phenomenologically directly, just internally, as we reflect on and moving around this, as we co-create and build together a shared understanding of what he called an affective landscape or a social topography, right? Let's together kind of emerge, and he uses fabric as a tool or an affordance, so that we can draw a picture together, if you like, to the extent that there is such drawings and such picture type activity happening, but it's not externalized. It's crafting the shared landscape in which we're trying to make sense of things. And Stephen's approach is trying to focus on allowing me to explore it, starting from where I am, in wherever terms that might be, and trying to allow me to explore it without interrupting me to ask me a question or to point to an external word or a meaning, because I'm constructing the meaning of what this landscape means to me with this complex situation or this complex social cultural problem. I'm discovering what it means to me as I explore that landscape together. So it's all about how do you go into what you are and explore from where you are what you're dealing with in the way that you begin, and to have that fostered and promoted and supported without being interrupted or reduced, but opened up to further exploration, to the point where you begin to build trust in your own understanding of this complex situation. And as Stephen pointed out, that night and day thing, some of the folks who would go through this process, when there was the complex social cultural situation might arise, they could intervene or they could act and become agents and have agency in the complex problem, because they had developed ground up, bottom up kind of emergent self-efficacy around their own, whatever that might be. It's not about extracting their understanding from their brain to draw it on a piece of paper and then give it a check mark. It's about facilitating the emergence and the discovery of their own understanding within themselves and their efficacy to be able to apply that well. And that challenge of not interrupting flow, facilitating flow, distinguishing between the demands of quote unquote reporting or describing and the meaningful progress made outside of reporting and describing, and being careful to those distinctions, and knowing when we're, having diminishing returns by saluting certain norms around that. Anyway, yeah, sorry, Paula, going on.
So is the key, I just want to ask one question, Stephen, is, because what I'm always interested in is like, what is the personal motivation that, I mean, because you just don't get into there's some abstract discussion about boundary objects. There's always something that relates it back to your life and why you found passion in this, so that you could work through what must be hundreds and hundreds of hours of slog to gain any bit of progress. And I was just wondering, is it the shy bit when you were dealing with these kids? What was in them that you felt connected to, that you wanted to bring out? What did you see in them that you felt from your experience that made you?
Yeah, so let me chew on that for a couple of minutes while I'm thinking about that. I'll make some notes, and I'll because I need a couple of minutes just to. But yeah, there's a couple of things, but it felt important. Let's put it like that, and inspiring. I mean, it was an area with 35% HIV, so it was quite a high stakes context, right? So the children there were. There's a lot of issues around HIV in that region. There's actually the highest incidence in the world of HIV near there at the time. So there was a lot of challenges, and I think this process and this work that we did, we ended up having a team of facilitators who facilitated that workshop around schools for 2,000 or 3,000 children over 4 or 5 years in Zulu language. So in a way, there was a practical sense of how to make this work for them. And for me, I also was doing these immersive multi-arts events in London just before then, and scenography. So there was an interest in space and meaning making and non-verbal stuff. But and maybe I think there's something in me that likes that. Now maybe there's a bit of autistic in me. I don't know, because that might be it. Because I find autistic people like this process. But I should just pass on. Yeah, probably a bit of that.
That's what it is.
Probably autisticism going on. But I should let Paula. I think Paula had her hand up there, and I was going to ask a question. So, or say something.
I lost my connection and I lost part of the conversation. But in my understanding, you guys, Stephen, are you trying to facilitate a space for kids to develop symbolic language so they can understand more about how they see the world, how they interact with the world, how they can be more connected to themselves and to the world. It's something like that.
Yeah. In that activity, the social drama one, they use like frozen pictures of their bodies. They use their bodies as like a language. Like Augusto Boal developed a lot of that in Brazil, actually, in his sort of theatre of the oppressed kind of work as an extension of. So they go in. The idea with social drama topography is you go in, you have a particular thematic adaptation that it's for. So for them, it was basically peer influence and peer pressure, and healthy choices. That was it. So it's the thing that really came from that is to keep a very nascent dimension. Like keep it simple. I don't know if the word simple, fairly fundamental. So what's the influence on behavior from other peers? Because we had originally peer pressure. Actually, pressure is a bit more of a higher word, and over there actually literally means in Zulu like actually really beating someone to do it. It's almost peer authority, which isn't quite what was meant. So I think there's something about working across language, and there's something about the language, this non-verbal way of communicating. So there's a kind of because it's a 3-day workshop, which you could never do. It's only because we're in this deep rural area. We got a class and we'd split them into 2 if there was 60 kids, and then that would be split into 2 or some, so basically we got to work for 2 weeks with a class solid. You never get that. If you come here, you're lucky you get an hour with a class doing drama of this kind, or 2 hours. So got this chance to develop this in a fairly unique sort of context in a way, and to really create this 3-day process and evolve it over years. And I think there's, and the idea was that nothing is said until the end of day 2, because one of the things was you wanted things to be confidential, because also they're dealing with stuff here about peer influences. You didn't want to know, so they put papers on the ground and then they clustered where they felt comfortable, not what they thought was most important, and they didn't say who wrote what. So there's just like a landscape of different peer influences, and hopefully it's not too disclosing, right? So it's a bit like this idea of a large group intervention, where you kind of, the system comes in the room, but it's not really a system. So I call it social topography. But there's something about that non-verbal, and this is, I think, in a way, that idea about them sort of sensing or predicting a social topography. What I'm seeing now, I didn't know about it, is very similar in a way to this guy, Carl Friston, talking about people predicting as a brain their environment, as opposed to before. It's like, I was thinking, as most people did, of a more like computational way of, I look at the world and it sees me. But so is this social topography? So that's why we use the word emergent, so we don't really have mechanisms for how that happens. But it could be more of an intuitive. Well, actually, this active influence comes out of the idea of Bayesian inference. It's basically a Bayesian weighting of many different types of predictive predictions. So you're sort of aggregating them, because at the end of the day, you only have one perception of the world. You don't have 10 at the same time, or millions. So in the same way, there's a sense that people are sort of sensing, like, where does it feel safer? Where does it not feel so safe? Where do you get more? Where do you feel like in your? So this is where it became not what happens in the space, which is what I was trying to do early on, and map that. Became where does it feel more like peer influence is more likely? Where are you more vulnerable to it? Where is the affordance for someone to pressure you greater? Is it around by the washroom, the toilets? Is it around by in the classroom? Is it in the corridor? So that's a really good question as well, and I think that could, it's actually good to be asked these questions, actually, because I kind of forgot where I came from. So it's really helpful.
So guys, we already gone way way in after the time. We almost do, Stefan, 1 hour and a half. Healthy thing, because we start to drain our brains to even to hear ourselves. So I just want to make 2 comments, and we can make a checkout round here, and be very welcome and this weekly RWI touchdown. So interesting too. So much things to ask, so much things to infer together, so much boundary objects to discover. So the thing is that as I'm hearing you and better understanding where you're coming from and where you're going through, I'm very pleased, because when you look out there in the university realm, right? You all things, when people talks about complexity, they think the complexity is systems thinking. So it's like it's related to system thinking, and that's because of the Santa Fe University, as you know, and they are the beacon of this systems thinking dynamics. That everything has to be and is systematized, right? And it isn't, right? So you can't reduce it to systematize things only in the level of the thinking, right? And even because the thinking dynamics itself is some type of sort of active inferencing. So, the second thing is the Malthusian take of societies, of life itself. It's all very statistical, and you have to generate all sorts of identities and put it in a type of a social graph. So with this work, we're deconstructing the notion, this very wide, broad notion of social graphs that Web2, Facebook, Twitter and things like that, they use as a tool to accommodate their complex algorithm and to put you in the box of all sorts of social graphs. So that's the other thing that I want to mention. So, and I was extremely pleased to hear, to know about you, and pleased to know that you have been doing this type of work, because it's so rare to encounter someone that it's actually, is aware of this quite of talkative points that we touch a little bit today in our touchdown here. So yeah, so for me is it, and very, very pleased to have you here, Stefan. Be very welcome, my friend. So that's for me, that's my checkout, and I pass to whoever wants to talk.
Well, I can do it. I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks, Stefan, for spending time with us. Team very, very often mentions you and your work. He brings it up. We're constantly reminded about what you do by team, and it's nice to have some time to listen to how you think. I think that's the most important thing I got from the conversation. Because we're not just passing each other's information, we also pass each other information about how we think and how we go about solving problems, right? So thank you.
Lauren,
I'll let Lauren go after she takes a big draw on her pipe thing.
Oh, I just think it's super interesting, because I think like everyone here in this room is super passionate about rules, in terms of like, do we think rule, like Tiberius thinks rules should be like the way he deals with them is they should be super explicit. Here is a copy of the rules. I will put it on the wall. These are the rules. Everyone now you know the rules. You can like be free and do stuff. And even though he has rules and makes it super clear, everyone's just like, well, TB, can I do this? Can I do this? Is it okay if I do this? And it because of that social dynamic of the peer-to-peer, like, oh, can I actually do this? You know, it doesn't work the way he like intends it to work. And Vinicius is like, no, there can't be rules, no rules. It will be free if we just have no rules. I will make it but then the no rules, it's like people are like, oh, well, what are the boundaries? Like, am I gonna like punish if I get out of the boundary? I don't know what the boundaries are. If I don't know what the boundaries are, like, I don't know like what I can actually do. But then I think Stephen, me and Paula are like we're trying to emerge some other like rule system where there's like a different interaction with rules, that like things are demonstrated, because culture, it's not like culture is not formed. We know this from David Graeber on like humans saying positively, oh, this is what we're about, these are our values that we like. That's not how culture is formed. Culture is formed when someone, like another person does something, and all of a sudden people are like, hey, you can't do that. And there was no rule against it. But like culture is formed when someone does something that was like just an assumption that they didn't even know that they had. So there are always rules in any kind of social group. You just don't, it's very complex, because a lot of times those rules aren't actually talked about. They're not explicit rules. And I think that the reason why neurodivergent people are so obsessed with these rules is like trying to navigate a space with this like bat sonar, and like things aren't where you predict them to be, and trying to get things that are like predictable, so your like brain engine can just know where you can go to be safe in a space of complexity that you don't have the agency, because you don't actually, what people say are the rules is never in reality what are the rules. So that's just my 2 cents, sorry.
Yeah, right on. Thanks. Yeah, it was good to chat about. Glad Stephen got a chance to say hello, and everyone a chance to meet Stephen. And I don't know, Tiberius, I don't know if I went on about that much about Stephen. I mean, a few times, but yeah, definitely over at least the last 6 months, Stephen, you must have come up at least 3 or 4 times or something like that, I think, right? But yeah, I think that's a great thing to bring up, Lauren, because this sort of inside out experiential in a spatial kind of, you know, effective space or a social topography, or this kind of phenomenological view, and maybe connected to this boundary object idea, is this idea of sort of emerging and bubbling up things that are meaningful. And I use things with quotes on it in a really general sense, and meaningful in whatever way that's meaningful to the person, right? So if you're saying that there's different lenses on the world and that they don't always line up, then what I always sort of see as a benefit or a value of this kind of approach is that it's an opportunity to sort of go back past, beyond, before language, and then maybe together get some people who in language or in the rules structure systems don't connect in the same way with those things, but take them back before that, and then use the space and interaction in a really emergent way to just, in a creative way, construct your own quote unquote shared virtual reality, or something that at least cross connects in ways that help to people to sort of co-navigate these complexities that you're probably would come up if you were to elaborate. You know what I mean? In a way that's more reliable, trustable, comfortable. You feel and right more of the time rather than moving in error. So so I think that's the strength. That's why that's also the challenge of why it's almost, well, it's extremely hard to talk about, because it's all about this getting away from words and stuff, right? But I think its benefit or its purpose are in the direction of exactly what you just pointed to. Is finding a more degrees of freedom, more primordial starting point for the construction of meaning, not in the sort of postmodern kind of sociological constructed meaning, big picture, hand wavy sense, but right in the moment. Where is your attention being taken? And therefore, what is that telling you about what's meaningful to you? And can you kind of follow that thread together? And if you can follow that thread together with different people in the same environment, maybe you can build some kinds of bridges, right? So, yeah, I think that's right on. Anyway, good chat.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah, so I think that's actually really, I've actually got a lot of really useful feedback and ideas and new thinking. So I think it's, the only thing I'd like to add is maybe there's something about going into a large group process and then coming out. There's something about going in and being able to do something in that window of maybe 1 hour or 2 hours, and then coming out, and it's good to have both worlds, the worlds that can find the way in, well, the worlds that can help get the way in, the worlds that can do something within, and then the world that can then use something like a boundary object to then encode it to come out again, because the challenge is otherwise it's only ever an experience in the event, right? Much as that's nice, how can that travel? And you need it to be kind of nailed down, killed and nailed down to something to travel, right? So this is great. Thanks so much for being so welcoming as well. I like the energy here. It's good. You got that kind of nice dynamic. It's good.
It's the about nothing part that really does it, I
think. So guys, that's it for today. Beautiful. See you, Stefan, TB, Tim, and Lauren, and whoever. Oh, you can invite people. Okay, Stefan. Already, you feel free to invite whoever you want to invite. Okay, this is totally open. It's not agenda driven. It's not. We don't have a program here. Nothing like that. It's just a free flow, interactive conversation between boundary objects with all sorts of affordances. Okay. Oh, so that's basically it. So, what a pleasure, folks. Be well and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. See you.